Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi at-tahirin. Today we are having our third short lecture of short jurisprudential points. And I was talking about the sections of fiqh. I was saying that one of our famous scholars, Muhakkik Hilli, he divided his book, Shara al-Islam, into four major sections, four major categorizations. The first was ibadat, those tabudi acts and those things which are related to being tabudi acts. Those things which are acts of worship. Those things which require niyatul qurba for their validity, for them to become valid. That is what Muhakkik Hilli divided into the section of ibadat. And then all those types of fiqh-related matters that were somehow related or prerequisites to ibadat were included in those chapters. So you had things like wudu. We have to be in a state of taharat spiritually to be able to pray. And also physically. We have to not pray with najasat al-ain on our body or our clothes. So in the book of ibadat we have kitab al-taharat. But there's all the other rules related to around it, like how to clean containers, what waters purify, what are different types of najasat. So Muhakkik Hilli divided this section of ibadat. In his categorization, he had this section of ibadat which had the acts of worship like Kitab al-Taharat, Kitab al-Salat, the book of prayers, Kitab al-Sawm, the book of fasting, and all these different books. Then the second section which he categorized in his categorization in his work was the uqud, those two-sided contracts. There's party A and party B, like marriage. Marriage is a two-sided contract, or trades and transactions are a two-sided contract. Then he had the section of iqa'at, those one-sided contracts. There's only party A, there's no second party involved. And then he had the miscellaneous ahkam, like your food and drink and your diya and all sorts of things over there, like that. All different types of things that are remaining that should be talked about in the fiqh. So I was saying that when we come to the acts of ibadat, first, worship is a kind of humility, is kind of like is humble submission to Allah the Exalted. Allah only deserves worship. So we have these very important acts of worship that we must be doing. Such ibadat we have to have the right intention. We have to have niyatul qurba. We have to have a sincere intention for doing this, to get closer to Allah, to obey Allah. And there's acts which we have to do to be able to do certain other things, like wudu. We need to be in a state of wudu for prayer, for touching Quranic script, for different things. Ghusl, if a person is needing a ghusl, they have to be in that. Salah is an act of worship. Salah is the most important act of worship. There is a narration narrated by Shaykh Kulaini from Muawiyah ibn Wahab in Al-Kafi, where he inquired of Imam alayhi salam, of Imam Abi Abdullah, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, as to what the most beloved, what kind of action could get a person nearer to Allah and is most beloved to Allah, what kind of deed, what kind of thing could do that. And Imam told him in this narration, he said, after you have ma'rifah, the most meritorious, afdal, the most meritorious thing, is salah, is prayer. So salah is the most important act of worship. It's the most important thing that we should be doing after our belief and our recognition, our awareness of Allah. We should be obeying Allah. And also, it takes away a munkar, it takes away bad, indecency, immoral things from us. It restrains them. So if we got to do our prayers, it's a major sin to leave the prayers. So prayer is the most important. Then we have in the section of ibadat, we had wudu, ghusl, salah, fasting, saum. Saum in the month of Ramadan is an obligatory thing. It's in the month of Ramadan. Hajj, which is coming up, which is Hajj season. Zakat and khums. All these different things are talked about in the section of ibadat. So, the next thing, before we end these brief points, is I want to make aware what hadath al-asghar and hadath al-akbar and khabath are. Because one of the first things that you're going to look at when you open a book of, whether it's a Risalat book or a Masail book or a higher level fiqh book, one of the first things you're going to come across in Kitab al-Taharat is Hadath al-Asghar, Hadath al-Akbar, Khabath, and these related things. So the whole Kitab al-Taharat is related to these things. So the first is those physical impurities called Khabath. Khabath is a physical impurity, like urine, stool, a mita, an animal that hasn't been slaughtered according to the Islamic method of tazkiyah. And when something like that touches something with visible wet contact, a kind of moisture or wet contact which is visible, kind of moisture, then it makes the other object najis. So we can't pray with that najasat on us. So we have to, and we can't eat that najasat. We can't eat the item or anything that's become najis like that. So the khabath needs a purifier. Khabath is physical impurity, and it's a set of several different things, and there's some differences of opinion on some of them amongst the scholars, whether they're najis or not. But generally, we just give the general title. Khabath is something which is physically impure, and when something becomes defiled by it, it has to be purified. It has to be purified before you could pray with it on you in your clothes or your body. And you cannot eat it or drink it. So it needs to have a purifier. So when it comes to purifying it on items or anything like that, or clothes or body, it has to have a purifier. The example is if you get blood on the hand. If you have blood on the hand, you remove the najasat of the blood, the substance, and you just wash it once, and you're good to go. So you purify it with water. The next type of, because that's physical impurity. It has a kind of intrinsic impurity to it. It just makes other things najis when it has a kind of visible wet contact. When you know that happens, like if you have certainty that that's happened, it's mitnan, then that's what that's what you'll go by. But then you have spiritual impurities, because sometimes we are in a state of spiritual impurity, which we need to do a certain act of worship to pull ourselves out of it. With the physical impurity, we didn't need no niyat or korba to make it pure. All we had to do was wash it with water, as example. All we had to do is do one of the purifiers, which are talked about in that book, the several purifiers to it. Then it became pure. But when it came to the spiritual najasas, the spiritual kind of impurities, as that we're in a state of spiritual impurity in our souls, then we have to do an act of worship. We have to do something spiritual for it. We have to do something with the right intention, with niyat or korba, with the intention of obedience to Allah, and do the right act in which Allah has commanded us, to be able to pull ourselves into a state of taharat, a state of spiritual purity. So, in that sense, we have two different levels of impurities for the spiritual side. I prefer using this word spiritual impurity rather than other words that sometimes some use. So the first is the minor one, called Hadath al-Asghar. Hadath al-Asghar is like if I fall asleep and I lose my sight, my hearing, I go in the state of Hadath al-Asghar. If I use the lavatory, I go in the state of Hadath al-Asghar. Hadath al-Asghar, when that happens, a person cannot touch Quranic script. A person cannot pray. They have to do something to pull themselves out of that state of hadath, to bring themselves into a state of purity. So how is that done? Wudu. Doing the act of worship of wudu. Or tayammum in certain situations. Like if a person woke up for Fajr time and they woke up so late that they couldn't make the prayer. They know if they did wudu, their prayer is going to be outside of time. They can go quickly and do tayammum, and they could go pray really quickly just for that prayer. That tayammum will be good. Okay, they got in it for the prayer. So Hadath al-Asghar, it needs wudu to remove the state of spiritual impurity. That's the minor type of spiritual impurity. Then we have the major type of hadath. Hadath al-Akbar. What's hadath al-Akbar? Hadath al-Akbar, like janaba, like hayd, like these kinds of things, touching the deceased body before it has its wash is done to it, after it's cooled down. So these kinds of things, they will require a full body ghusl to remove that state of impurity. A person cannot go do wudu in their place. They're either going to require a full body ghusl, or if the activation, the allowance for tayammum was allowed, then they could do tayammum. But generally, as long as there's available water and there's not shortage of time for it, they go do ghusl. They do a full body wash. And Sayyid Sistani's ruling is you wash the head, neck area first, and then the body. Right side, left side is mustahab precaution. So, but some scholars may say that you have to do the right side and left side. So, and this is an act of worship. It requires niyatul qurba for it to be valid. It requires that that it is a tabudi act. A tabudi act. Like we have these obligations, these rulings that are tabudi and tawassuli. Tawassuli are those kinds of things in which you don't need the niyat or qurba for them to be valid. Like if a person recited a marriage contract for a couple without any other intention except wanting to be paid. He wanted to be paid for his time. Maybe he recited it very beautifully and he charged a lot of money. That's his, okay, it's his loss that he didn't make it an act of worship, but it didn't affect the marriage contract of the people. That marriage contract is valid. So, tabudi are those kinds of acts of worship which require the niyat or qurba for them to be valid. They require you're doing it for obedience to Allah. You're aware of that's why you're doing it in your heart. So ghusl and wudu are the same way. They need that. If a person just goes and washes, then it's just a shower or something, it's not going to be sufficient if they didn't have that intention. Or if they just washed the face and the arms, it's not going to be sufficient if they didn't have that intention, that niyatul qurba. So some guy comes and he goes and he does the actions of wudu. He's not doing it for any other reason. He's just washing the face, completely nothing, absent from anything out of obedience to Allah in him. And then he goes and he says his prayer. He comes to us and he says, "Is my prayer valid?" We're going to tell him, "No, you're going to have to go redo your wudu and your prayer, because your wudu is invalid. You didn't have taharat. You have to have taharat to be able to go pray." So these are the types of impurities. And these types, when it comes to hadath al-asghar and hadath al-akbar, they're not transferable. They're not like physical najasat. A woman who is in hayd, she doesn't make things najis. A guy who is in janaba or touched the deceased body, he's not going to make other things najis, provided there's nothing najis on their hands, but otherwise they're not going to make other things najis with wet on wet contact. They could cook the food and things like that. There's none of that. What is there is it's just a spiritual state, and they just have to do ghusl or wudu for it to be removed. So this is where we'll end for this time. Wal akhiru dawana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Jazakum Allah.